President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank my colleague from Maryland for outlining one of the cases for why the override of the president's veto is so important. There is no question that Saudi Arabia has in no way moderated their human rights behavior since the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In fact, as Senator Van Hollen has rightly pointed out, the stick in America's eye from Riyadh has just gotten sharper. The number of executions has increased. More American citizens are being detained. I didn't catch it as to whether Senator Van Hollen specifically referenced the case of Dr. Fatahi, a Harvard-trained physician who has allegedly been tortured, including stripped to his underwear and shocked with electricity. He has been in detention without charges or a trial for a year and a half after his arrest. The Saudis' behavior has gotten more outrageous, has crossed more human rights lines, has compromised the safety of more American citizens, and yet no response from the United States Congress. Not a single piece of legislation moving through the United States Senate that would hold the Saudis accountable for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and now the detention of multiple U.S. residents. We almost shut down our relationship with Turkey over the detainment of an American pastor, but there is no similar response from this body when it comes to the continued detention of Americans in Saudi Arabia with no trial, with no charges, and with evidence of torture. How is that? How is that? Today, we specifically litigate the case of the disastrous war that continues to rage inside Yemen today. I want to read you a very short excerpt written by a hardened U.S. diplomat. Jeffrey Feltman is not a Democrat or Republican. He was a career Foreign Service officer, did some of the toughest duty in the Middle East, including a stint as our ambassador to Lebanon. Many people know him, and I know he commands just as much respect from Republicans as he does from Democrats. Here's what he wrote. He said, "The war in Yemen has been a disaster for U.S. interests, for Saudi interests, and above all for the Yemeni people. It has sparked the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and 14 million are at risk of starvation. It has been a strategic blunder as well, producing the exact results the Saudi-led military campaign was designed to prevent. The Houthis are more militarily sophisticated and better able to strike beyond Yemen's borders than they were at the start of the war. Iranian influence has expanded, and the relationship between the Houthis and Lebanon's Hezbollah has only deepened. And although the UAE has waged an effective battle against al-Qaeda in Yemen, terrorism remains a grave threat." Now, I could read you similar pronouncements from all sorts of other Middle Eastern experts. There is a hegemony of opinion that this war has been a disaster, not just from a humanitarian standpoint. And I had to select a picture that frankly wouldn't induce sickness from my colleagues. I chose a picture in which this young, starving boy's back is turned to the camera, but there are plenty others in which you would have a hard time holding down your lunch. It's not just the humanitarian nightmare, it is the strategic nightmare that is Yemen. Every single day that we stay involved in this war, the battle lines do not change. And yet, Iran and Hezbollah get more and more involved inside the military fight. There is a political deal to be had here. If the United States chose to lead diplomatically instead of follow militarily, there is a political deal that can be had. But for reasons that I do not understand, the United States does not lead the diplomatic negotiations. We outsource that to the UN. I'm a big fan of the UN, but there is not going to be a peace settlement in Yemen without the United States as the lead. Instead, we simply choose to follow the military campaign of the Saudis by helping them engage in a bombing campaign that has murdered thousands of civilians, either on purpose or by accident, has destroyed the civilian infrastructure of the country. And it does not relent. Every single time you meet with somebody from the administration, they tell you, well, it's getting better, it's getting better. There's really no evidence of that. On March 26th, airstrikes reportedly hit a hospital supported by Save the Children in northwest Yemen, killing at least 7, including 4 children. And there's no excuse for that, because every single hospital is on the list of targets that the Saudis can't hit, and yet they continue to do so. Senator Romney and I just came back from the region. Here's what we heard. All of the relief agencies that do the big heavy lifting in Yemen flew into Amman, Jordan, to talk to our delegation. I thought it was exceptional that they were making this trip. But then when they delivered the news that they had, I understood why they were making the trip into Jordan to meet with us. The report that they gave us was absolutely bone-chilling. And I want you to listen to this. Today in Yemen, there are 250,000 Yemenis who are so malnourished and so sick that they are beyond saving. They will die. 250,000 Yemenis are so sick, are so malnourished that they cannot be saved. And another 10 million are on the cusp of entering that category. The only way to stop this humanitarian disaster of a scope and scale that we see nowhere else in the world is to end this civil war. And so long as the United States participates in the military campaign with the Saudis, while not offering any meaningful pressure to get to a political settlement, we are complicit in those deaths. 250,000 people are going to die in the next several months inside Yemen from starvation and disease and malnutrition due to a military campaign that we are a part of. Don't get me wrong, the Houthis bear a great degree of responsibility for those that are starving inside territories that they control. There is still 15 to 20% of relief supplies that the Houthis steal and take for themselves, but hundreds of thousands of those who are dying or who are subject to disease and famine are in the parts of the country that are controlled by our coalition. This isn't just a matter of the Houthis refusing to let supplies get to people that need them. There are people dying in parts of the country that the coalition of which the United States is a part of controls. And we are standing by largely idly as this devastation continues. I hope that my colleagues will consider voting to overturn the president's veto. I hope that you will do it because it is the only means by which we force a political settlement. I hope you will do it because even if you don't think that a political settlement is coming, the United States should never willingly be a part of a bombing campaign that results in this kind of starvation. But I hope you will also do it because even if you believe that Iran is the number one objective of U.S. interests in the region, or even if you believe that al-Qaeda and ISIS are the number one target of U.S. interests in the region, they are getting stronger every single day that the status quo continues. The military campaign has been a massive failure. The battle lines don't move, and al-Qaeda and ISIS remain uniquely strong inside that country because of the chaos, and Iran every single day becomes more and more influential. Get out of the military campaign, take the lead on the diplomatic effort rather than simply follow others, and we will end this misery. It is within our power to send that message. I agree with Senator Van Hollen. This is also about sending a message to Saudi Arabia about the continued murder and detainment of American citizens and residents. This is about standing up for human rights in the face of 37 people convicted and beheaded inside Saudi Arabia, several of them minors. But this is also about squaring U.S. policy with national security interests and getting the blood off of our hands as 250,000 Yemenis face certain death if we don't do something different very soon. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Maryland.
Madam President, I really want to thank Senator Murphy for his long-standing commitment to this humanitarian need. We are now just a Senate vote away from making a major difference in regards to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And every member of the Senate will now be on record. So I want Senator Murphy to know that his work has been extremely important and is well understood. And that he is saying, I just really want to underscore, and that is the U.S. military engagement with the Saudi Arabia and its partners is counterproductive not just to the humanitarian crisis that exists today in Yemen, but to America's national security interest. The conflict in Yemen has become a humanitarian nightmare. At this point, our involvement does not advance the interests of the United States, our partners, or regional stability. I recognize that we have a strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia and that we have a mutual desire to prevent the expansion of Iranian influence and terrorist groups who seek to do us harm. However, our current military support to Saudi Arabia, to the Yemen conflict, has become detrimental to these shared goals and our broader partnership. Madam President, the suffering this conflict has caused is beyond measure. More than 22 million people, nearly 75% of the population, are at grave risk. The country has now seen the world's largest cholera outbreak, which has killed thousands. Hunger and malnutrition are threatening 2 million innocent children under the age of 5. A recent Save the Children report concluded some 85,000 children have already died from starvation since the war began. Morally, continuing our military involvement in this disaster simply should not be an option. I would also like my colleagues to look beyond our direct support to the role U.S. arms sales play in worsening the conflict. These sales cannot come at the expense of human rights, mass atrocities, and regional destabilization. Saudi Arabia has shown a disregard for international law by inflicting devastating losses on civilians, including young children. It is now well known that the Saudi-led coalition targets civilians and infrastructure vital to Yemen's recovery and reconstruction. In fact, a recent UN report concluded that the coalition air campaign is the leading cause of civilian casualties in Yemen, with 61% due to coalition airstrikes. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Bellingcat have found that the U.S. weapons have been used in these unlawful airstrikes. There is evidence that the coalition has used banned and inherently indiscriminate weapons like white phosphorus and cluster bombs. The military conflict has produced staggering human rights abuses. The AP, international organizations, and a special expert group established by the UN Human Rights Council have found that all parties in the conflict have committed grave violations of human rights and the laws of war. Houthi war crimes and abuses are staggering. However, reports indicated our supposed partners is also engaged in horrific abuses, including widespread torture and sexual abuse of coalition-run secret prisons. For all these reasons, it is imperative that there be a speedy and peaceful conclusion to the conflict in Yemen. It is clear, however, that this will not come from our military involvement. We must instead focus our efforts on supporting UN-led efforts to foster dialogue, a ceasefire, and humanitarian access. It is critical to prevent an expansion. It is critical to prevent expansion of the Iran influence and extreme groups in the region, but our military involvement is not helping us in that regard. Experts from across the ideological spectrum agree that the escalation of the conflict has increased Iran's and extreme groups' influence in Yemen. Our military campaign is counterproductive to our objective to minimize the influence and hopefully eliminate the influence of Iran and extreme groups. With all these considerations in mind, Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House of Representatives came together to pass Senate Joint Resolution 7. For reasons that are still incomprehensible to me, the President chose to veto this resolution. Oxfam recently responded to this by stating, and I'll quote, "The people of Yemen, the parties to the conflict, are watching closely, and the messages U.S. leaders send have the power to save lives. With a veto, they lost faith in the United States to see the end of their suffering a little further out of reach." Madam President, it's not, however, too late for Congress to do the right thing. By overriding this veto, we assert this body's authority to support peace and human rights while making America safer and more secure. Madam President, I would yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.